Hello, my name is Mr. Chipman. I teach biology, AP Biology at Murray High School in Murray, Kentucky. This is Unit 2 of AP Environmental Science 2.6 Adaptations. Let's look. What is an adaptation? It's the process by which organisms become better suited for their environment. So if you want to use it as a noun, an adaptation is something that causes or allows an organism to be better suited for the environment they live in. This is brought about by variations in genetics, which is ultimately brought about by changes in the genes. And again, it's not something that the organism chooses, rather it is something that happens and then they become better suited. We're going to look at that idea of natural selection towards the end of the lecture, but you can see all of these organisms are suited for the environment they live in. They all seem really, really pleased to be where they are. Ducks with their feet and walruses with their feet, and hippos love the water as well. So there are two different kinds of adaptations that we're going to look at, two different categories, probably a better way to think about it. They're short-term adaptations, and a short-term adaptation is something that happens because of a short-term change in the ecosystem, something that happens maybe seasonally or something along those lines. It's a great example. Plants have an adaptation that allows them to open and close their stomata, which is the opening by which CO2 comes in to the plant in order for photosynthesis to occur, and water leaves. Water is leaving the leaves constantly in order to pull water up from the roots using capillary action, pulling that water up. And so if you don't want water to leave, then you close those openings. This is exactly what you see here, which is an adaptation for drought. Other plants that have that live in constant drought conditions, like a desert or something like that, have other adaptations that are more suited for the long-term stability of the plant, whereas this is something that can happen. Plants where I'm from, in a temperate area, have this sort of adaptation where they can open and close their stomata when there's more or less water available to them. A long-term adaptation is a genetic change in a population over multiple generations, right? So this is like, you have your ancestral finch in the Galapagos Islands, and those finches move off to other subsequent islands, and through genetic change, there are adaptations that are more suited for those, and those adaptations survive. The ones that aren't adapted to the new island die, and you have these population shifts over time, over long periods of time, right? And so then you have all these different kinds of finches that result from that. Adaptations always arise through natural selection. Individuals, again, with better traits that are better suited for the environment will survive, and those that aren't will not. So how do organisms respond to changes in their environment? I just love the picture of the polar bear stranded on that little block of ice. It's like standing like that as if it was in some sort of like distress. But, it's kind of the poster child for climate change, which is a real thing, right? And so how are animals like polar bears responding to that change? Well, it's usually one of three things that occurs. There's an adaptation that occurs as a result of that, meaning it's not the polar bears get together and like meet and how they should change. Rather, the ones that are better suited for that new environment will live, and the ones that aren't will die. They can migrate, which is what you're actually seeing with polar bear populations. They tend to move toward areas that are better suited for their own lifestyle, which are decreasing, and so that causes migration to be more and more difficult. And so migration is another thing. Move to those areas that are better suited. And then the last one is just they don't make it, right? They die off. Extinction occurs. And again, these responses are going to vary depending on the rate of change, depending on the amount of genetic diversity in a population. Population may be able to adapt really quickly versus some populations that are more specialist type populations are not going to be able to adapt. It has to do with the mobility of a species. Like polar bears can swim like 100 miles or something with And so the polar bear is not in trouble, right? It doesn't need to grab a hold of the black line on top of the comic here, but you get the idea. And so we've mentioned natural selection, and I've kind of hinted at this, and I want to make sure it's clear. A lot of times when someone says natural selection, the first words that will come to their mind is like survival of the fittest, right? Which is fine. It's fine. But the other side of that coin is that the not fittest doesn't survive, right? In the picture where giraffes can't reach the trees, there are dead giraffes, right? Because they couldn't eat. And so how is this population going to get better over time? The short giraffe is going to stop breeding, right? And I think that's very important as you consider these adaptations. The reason that there's change at all in any of these things we've talked about is because the ill-suited organisms died and those better suited lived. Very important in understanding adaptations. A couple of examples. So this is a very famous example. Peppered moths lived on white trees in England, and you can see the one on the right is very suited for a white tree, right? Less likely to get eaten that way. And then enter Industrial Revolution, which is a short-term change, and all the trees are covered with soot. And then there's a variation in the population where the moths are black. So which variation is going to live through the Industrial Revolution? The black moth, of course. The white moth is going to be ill-suited for this new environment. And then enter in change, right, where we start to say, hey, we need to stop covering our trees with soot. And they have some regulations that allow for that, and then the trees aren't covered with soot anymore, and the black variation no longer exists as much, and the white variation comes back. So it's a very short-term type adaptation there. Arctic foxes, great example of a long-term variation. This is an Arctic fox in mid-change, right? Arctic foxes' coats change with the season. Most of the time they have a white coat because the area is covered with snow, but for that short amount of time that it's not, they lose their snowy coverings and they become more blended with the background, allows them to be more efficient predators and escape predation. Foxes are not at the top of the food chain. So let's look at a practice problem. This graph shows the number of finch offspring in 1978. It's a great year, 1978 was, across different beak depths following a severe drought in 1977. Based on the data, which of the following best describes the relationship between beak depth and offspring success in this population? This is really just a graph reading problem. A little bit of content you could enter here, sort of, but part of this class is being able to look at graphs and understand what you're looking at. And I look at this graph and I see that it's not really the most or the least that gives the best number of birds, but sort of an intermediate condition. Let's go find that answer. Birds with smaller beak depths are more likely to survive. No, they're not. Finches with an intermediate to larger beak depths had great reproductive success. That seems to be the case, does it not? It is. Hopefully this was helpful. 2.7 is coming up. That represents the end of Unit 2. Hopefully this is helpful. See you.